Hey, welcome back to another video with Coach K. If you're wanting to learn how to sketch and draw like an industrial designer, you have found the right channel. I'm here to help you out and give you some tips and tricks along the way that might help you out. Okay, so I actually had a request this week from a former student of mine who's working up in the Boston area, but she had a specific request for a video on rendering or sketch rendering a task chair with a mesh back on it. Okay, so there'd be some level of transparency to that. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to make a few patterns and apply them both in Photoshop and in Sketchbook. So here we go. Let's get sketching. All right, so I'm always telling you, work smarter, not harder, right? So you got to work with underlays. I've been doing this for 30 years. I've used underlays from working on light tables now to working digitally. It's really all the same. So recently I've used Adobe Dimension to bring in a three-dimensional model, and you can set up your perspective views for your ideation or your more or less your final sketch renders. Which really demand a little bit more attention, or attention to detail anyway. So what I've done here is, Adobe Dimension has a lot of built-in models that you can access that are great for spinning it around, finding a nice perspective view. And so I went on to GrabCAD and found a task chair. And that's kind of the exercise today, is the mesh-backed task chair. So here's one right here. So what I really want to do is just use this and take some screen captures for underlays in my perspective views, right? So, I really like kind of the low angle. It's a little bit more dynamic. It's a little bit more like that automotive view that they take, where you're basically almost at the ground level. On the sketches that I'm doing here, the horizon line would essentially be almost at the seat level, right? So you see a little bit more perspective happening on the top of the backrest, and so that's kind of what I wanted to do. And I wanted almost the feel of a full 360, right? So from left to right, it goes from rear perspective view to a front orthographic view to a right front view. And so that should allow me to really address a whole lot of detail on the design that I want to project out there. So the key, of course, is you're not copying what is on the underlay. You're just using it as a base for developing your design, right? So their perspective, your design, and that's really what is the overall objective behind this, right? So I'm spending a little bit of time in this video on the sketch itself, but it's really going to come down to how do we address kind of creating that mesh pattern that was requested. And so, but it's important, I always say that the line drawing is kind of the backbone of your overall presentation. So you really want to make sure that you have a great perspective and that you are picking views that really address the details that you need to communicate, right? Really communicating your design intent. And so I feel like these three views on this particular drawing do that. It has a lot to do with the controls and levers and knobs underneath the chair. So if I had a much higher perspective view looking down on the chair, I wouldn't see those controls at all. or those knobs or levers. So okay, so I'm going in now into Illustrator, and very simply I'm going to use an X, the letter X, as a pattern for my mesh. And so what I've done is I've brought the I've created the letter X with the text function there, and now I'm going to create an outline of that text under the type menu. And so what that does is it creates a vector of that letter, I suppose. So it's not, you cannot manipulate or change that letter now other than through vector points and lines. So but basically I'm going to transform and move in each direction, and that's a very simple thing to do. You can put in an accurate measurement. You can also just cut and paste and drag the letter in the X or Y axis, and that way you can have an overlap or a space between the letters. Sometimes the overlap actually creates much more of a stitched look to it, and we'll see that in just a moment. But right now I'm going back, and now that I've created that, I exported that pattern as a PNG file, so the background is transparent, and I'm going to bring it into Photoshop here, and this is where I'm going to manipulate it. Okay, so the first thing that I've done is I've created a path around the area that you see as blue. Okay, so the fabric color I'm choosing is the blue, and so I did a fill of blue and drop the opacity level. Now I placed embedded the pattern that we created in Illustrator, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale it around, get it to fit well, and then the first thing I'm going to do is go back under transform, and I'm going to distort it, and what that's going to do is really put it into perspective. Now you need to double check. You may very well have a smart object with that pattern when you imported that or placed it into your drawing. So you might need to go into the layers menu and rasterize that layer. That's going to allow you to manipulate it, and distort it and warp it like we're going to do just now. So here's the distortion, and basically all that does is really put it into perspective. It puts our pattern into perspective. We're going to place that and set it, and now we're going to go back to transform, and we're going to choose the warp function. And so that really allows us to push and pull that fabric to conform to the more organic form of that backrest. So you can see here I can pull the anchor points, I can manipulate them, and ultimately what I'm going to do here is I'm going back to the path that I used for filling the blue. I made that a selection again, and I inverted that, and that allowed me to delete what's outside of that pattern. So now, as you can see, I have a pretty convincing pattern just made out of X's in Illustrator. So it's really kind of cool. Another very quick way, and remember, I always talk about efficiency. As designers, we never, I'll say, we never have extra time on projects. So we have to be efficient and try to find ways. So as you create these patterns in Illustrator, be sure and save them. Create a folder on your desktop that's our, patterns for renderings. In Photoshop here, this is a really quite simple one, because really what I just filled that area with was a brush function, right? So literally it's part of, it's built into, I didn't create the brush, it's actually in Photoshop. You can use that and then create the path area, make it a selection, and then again paint within that, and that particular paint function fills in a very regular way. In other words, the strokes don't overlap, or when they do overlap, the pattern doesn't overlap. So it's a nice linear application with a brush. The last version here on the left was very similar to the one on the right, if not really identical, other than I used the letter O as opposed to the letter X. So it really looks more like a perf pattern, if you will. But you can see as I apply it here, it's the same function. So I'm going back through the transform function in Photoshop. I'm distorting it, and then I'm going back in after that, and I'm using the warp function to get that kind of wavy conformation to the form that we're looking for ultimately. There, and so now you can see that the selection area was different, of course, because I have details on the back of that chair that are in front of the mesh material. But here's kind of the final version, right? And so I'm panning around to show you some really quick applications of what you can do, and that's it.